Hello, I'm Andrew Walsh, an anthropology instructor at the University of Western Ontario. In this mini lecture, I'd like to talk to you about research I've been doing on Madagascar's ecotourism and sapphire mining industries. There are three main things I want to accomplish with this talk. First, I'd like to give you an example of how ethnographic research requires anthropologists to take the perspectives of the people with whom we do research seriously, in ways that may even lead us to question our own assumptions and lead us to new understandings of what we take for granted. Second, I'd like to encourage you to think critically in the ways that anthropologists do about the question of value. And I'll do this, as the title of my talk suggests, by calling attention to different perspectives on the value of sapphires, lemurs, and other natural wonders that can be found in Madagascar. Finally, I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that although anthropological research of the kind I describe here often takes place in settings that may seem very different to you, the lives of the people living in such settings are not as disconnected from your own lives as you might imagine. A key point to keep in mind throughout this talk is that anthropology is not the study of other people. It's the study of all people, and so is as much about what ties humans together as it is about what sets us apart from one another. Madagascar is a large island nation located in the southern Indian Ocean, off the southeast coast of Africa. It's best known in some circles as a place of natural wonders, spectacular landscapes and species of plants and animals that you just can't find anywhere else in the world. This reputation is especially appropriate to the region in the far north of Madagascar, in which I've been doing research since the early 1990s, a place called Ankarana. Ankarana takes its name from this huge limestone massif that dominates the local landscape. It's a spectacular place. In fact, over the years, the national park that has developed around the Ankarana Massif has attracted film crews, international researchers, and a growing number of ecotourists, all of them intent on documenting or experiencing the place's distinctive landscapes, plants, and animals. Ankarana is more than just a destination for foreigners, however. The region surrounding the national park is also inhabited by tens of thousands of Malagasy people, as the citizens of Madagascar are known, including some who have migrated here since the late 1990s in hopes of making a living by mining and selling sapphires. The kind of sapphire mining that goes on in Ankarana is known as artisanal mining, meaning that it involves people working independently or in small groups with very simple tools, digging pits that they hope will lead to the gemstones thereafter. As you can see from these images, this kind of work produces landscapes that look very different than the ones that foreign tourists come to the region to see. In fact, many advocates of the region's ecotourism industry see sapphire mining as a major problem, not just because of how it can make spectacular landscapes ugly, but because miners, some of whom work illegally inside Ankarana National Park, are seen to pose a threat to the conservation of the region's biodiversity, the stuff that ecotourists come to see. I started doing research on Ankarana's sapphire industry in the late 1990s. As is often the case with ethnographic research, this meant spending months living, hanging out, and talking with Malagasy sapphire miners and traders in the town that had become the industry center. Thankfully, I had worked in the region previously and so could speak the Malagasy language. A key thing to understand about this sort of research is that it requires anthropologists to think carefully about how others see the world. And that means not just asking questions of people, but also listening to the questions they are asking us. We can learn as much from these as anything. Of all the questions I was asked during my first stay in this town, the one that most surprised me was one that Malagasy sapphire miners and traders thought that I, as a foreigner, ought to be able to answer. "What are sapphires used for?" they would ask. "What makes them worth so much money?" Here I should say that prior to the arrival of foreign sapphire buyers in the region in the 1990s, Malagasy people did not consider these stones valuable. In fact, many joked that before foreign buyers came, the only local people who were interested in these stones were young boys who used them as pellets in their slingshots. I answered questions about the value of sapphires as best I could by saying that these stones are used in making jewelry that foreigners buy because they think it looks beautiful and want to wear it or to give it as a gift to someone else. As time went on, though, and I was questioned about the value of these little blue stones over and over again, I started wondering myself, just what is it about sapphires, these very ordinary-looking blue stones, that makes them so valuable to foreign consumers? I didn't have to go far to find other foreigners to whom I could look for inspiration in helping me answer this question. At least once a day in this mining town, foreign eco-tourists would drive through in vans and 4x4s. Often they would stop, get out, and wander around. Sometimes they would even buy sapphires to take home as souvenirs. But they would never stay long. After all, they hadn't come to Madagascar to visit a mining town. They were on their way to Ankarna National Park, the conservation area surrounding the massif I mentioned earlier that was just down the road. And once again, my neighbors in the mining town had questions. Who were these foreigners, they asked me. What are they after in Madagascar? And once again, their questions got me wondering. What were these foreigners finding in Ankarna that they couldn't find in the places they came from? To answer this question, I did more ethnographic research, this time with foreign eco-tourists and the Malagasy guides and park employees who make their experiences of Ankarna possible. And what I learned from this research may not come as a surprise to many of you. Foreign eco-tourists who come to Ankarna value the region's landscapes, plants, and animals in ways that make them willing to pay thousands of dollars for the privilege of experiencing them. Why not go to a zoo close to home if you want to see lemurs or chameleons, I would sometimes ask. It's just not the same, they would answer. As one Malagasy guide explained, for foreign eco-tourists, encountering a lemur or a chameleon in Ankarna is, in a word, authentique, authentic. It is a natural encounter that is quite different than the artificial wildlife encounters enabled by zoos. As you might imagine, when tourists and their guides encountered abandoned pits or other signs of the sapphire mining going on within the national park, they tended to react with dismay and sometimes even anger. Many were quick to fault Malagasy miners for endangering or destroying what is so wonderful and distinctive about Ankarna. Before you jump to the same conclusion, however, I'd like you to join me in thinking carefully about why it is that Malagasy miners are going into Ankarna National Park in search of sapphires. Doing so will hopefully lead you where it's led me as I've been doing this research. That is, to a more complex understanding of the situation at hand. As I mentioned earlier, Malagasy miners and traders have no use for sapphires. They are only interested in them because mining and selling sapphires is a way of making a living. And they're only able to make a living from mining and selling sapphires because foreign consumers are willing to pay a great deal for these little blue stones. Which, of course, brings us back to the question that miners and traders so often asked me. What is it about sapphires that come out of the ground in Ankarna that makes them so valuable to foreign consumers? One way of thinking about what makes sapphires mined in Madagascar so valuable to people is to consider how they're different than an obvious alternative. One of the most surprising things I've learned about sapphires over the past 20 years is that they don't, in fact, only come out of the ground. Sapphires can also be made in a laboratory through a process that produces so-called synthetic sapphires that have the same physical and chemical properties as mine sapphires. Synthetic sapphires tend to be flawless. They can come in an array of colors, and once cut and mounted in jewelry, they seem to my eye to be just as, if not more beautiful than sapphires that come out of the ground in Ankara. What's more, these lab-produced synthetic sapphires cost a fraction of what mine sapphires of similar quality cost. This raises yet another question worth thinking about. If high-quality, low-cost sapphires can be produced in a lab, why are people working so hard to dig these little blue stones out of the ground in Ankara? You might already know the answer. The fact is that foreign consumers, and maybe even you, do not think of or value mined sapphires and synthetic sapphires in the same way, no matter how physically and chemically identical they may be. Sapphires that come out of the ground in Ankara are characterized by many as real and authentic, while sapphires that come out of a laboratory are often considered artificial or fake. And to people who think of mined and synthetic sapphires in these ways, there is no question as to which kind of sapphires are and should be more valuable. There's just something about natural sapphires that makes them fundamentally different and more valuable than synthetic sapphires. I imagine that many of you have your own ideas about the differences between mined and synthetic sapphires, just as you do about what makes encountering an animal in the wild different than encountering one in a zoo. I hope you also realize, however, that in many cases, these ideas that you have reflect a broader set of assumptions about the value of things and experiences that you and the people you know best might call natural or authentic. And I hope this leads you to an appreciation of how the way you value certain things is a key part of the story of what's been going on in Ankara over the past 20 years. A key point that I'd like you to take from this talk is that Ankara's sapphire industry has much more in common with the region's ecotourism industry than you might previously have imagined, certainly more than I imagined when I started the research I've described to you. Simply put, both of these industries really, ultimately, exist to serve the demand of consumers who generally live far from Ankara. If it weren't for how foreigners value the region's sapphires, landscapes, plants, and animals as natural and authentic in the ways that they do, the ways that maybe some of you do too, the lives of the Malagasy people I've come to know through this research would look very different than they do now. This point in mind, it would be a mistake to characterize the problems that have come with sapphire mining and ecotourism in Ankara as the problems of other people living elsewhere. As with so many of the issues we address in anthropology today, these are the problems of people living in an interconnected world, from which we, by this I mean you and me and people in Ankara, can never really remove ourselves. I'll end by saying that this is what, to me at least, makes anthropology so interesting. It encourages us to think carefully about the complexity of human lives in ways that are always relevant to the world in which we live. As mentioned at the start, anthropology isn't about other people living in places like Ankara. It's about all people. I'll end there and say thanks for listening and watching, and if you have any questions or comments, you can find me online at the University of Western Ontario.